Okay, so this fourth question asks, although fictional, can we as historians use this book to help us understand the Vietnam War? How? Be specific. And although this book is a work of fiction and you can't really use it to get any like maybe like discernible facts about the Vietnam War, this is not what this book is about. It's not about presenting the facts as it is. It's about how it like feels to be in the Vietnam War, which I think this book does a really good job about. If you want to know like concrete facts about like battles, casualties, numbers, all that good stuff, go read a history book. But if you want to like know what it feels like what these soldiers were going through in the Vietnam War, read the things they carry. So in the first short story of this book, Tim O'Brien does actually list a lot of the things they carry. I'm gonna quote from the book on page 2. The things they carried were largely determined by necessity. Among the necessities, or near necessities, were P38 can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, wristwatches, dog tags, mosquito repellent, chewing gum, candy, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military payment certifications, sea rations, and 2 or 3 canteens of water. And this book is not called The Things They Carried though because of the actual physical things they carried. It's called The Things They Carried because it's about the emotional baggage and how these men deal with that emotional baggage. That's like the real things they carried. And all these men have different ways of kind of dealing with this, and there are many examples throughout the book, like how Henry Dobbins wore his uh, girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck, and how Kiowa, you know, brought his New Testament, uh, and how Jimmy Cross would carry Martha's pictures with him. And all these men would carry these things because it was a little taste of home, or at least some sort of comfort or safety. They had these weird superstitions with these items. They thought it brought them like good luck, security. It helped them get through this war. And I think those types of things are get lost in the bigger picture. If you were to read a history book, you probably wouldn't learn about how these men dealt with all the atrocities of war. All right, all the anxiety that comes with it. You would never learn about these little superstitions they have, and that's why I think it's good, even if you're an historian, to read nonfiction books like these because it brings in the aspect of the war you might not get from reading a purely historical, uh, you know, book, right? There's a more of an emotional side to it rather than just strict facts. So I'm gonna just read a quote that does a good job explaining what I was trying to say. It's on page 20. They were tough. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die: grief, terror, love, longing. These are all intangibles, but the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide, and in many respects, this was the heaviest burden of all, for it could never be put down. It required perfect balance and perfect posture. They carried their reputations. They carried the soldiers' greatest fear, which was the fear of blushing. Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what they had brought them to the war in the first place. Nothing positive, no dreams of glory or honor, just to avoid the blush of dishonor. They died so as not to die of embarrassment. They crawled into tunnels and walked point and advanced under fire. Each morning, despite the unknowns, they made their legs move. They endured. They kept hunting. They did not submit to the obvious alternative, which was to simply close the eyes and fall. So easy, really. Go limp and tumble to the ground and let the muscles unwind and not speak and not bulge until your buddies picked you up and lifted you into the chopper that would roar and dip its nose and carry you off to the world. a mere matter of falling, yet no one ever fell. It was not courage exactly. The object was not valor. Rather, they were too frightened not to be cowards. So, um, yeah, this quote does a good job about describing the emotional side of what it felt like to be a soldier. So I want to go into more specifics about how these men would cope with the stresses of war, and a good example is in the short story Spin. I'm gonna read a quote really quickly. It's on page 31. I remember Norman Barker and Henry Dobbins playing chess every evening before dark. It was a ritual for them. They would dig a foxhole and get the board out and play long, silent games as the sky went from pink to purple. The rest of us would sometimes stop by to watch. There was something restful about it, something orderly and reassuring. There were red checkers and black checkers. The playing field was laid out in a strict grid, no tunnels or mountains or jungles. You knew where you stood, you knew the score, the pieces were out on the board, the enemy was visible. You could watch tactics unfolding into larger strategies. There was a winner and a loser, there were rules. So obviously, checkers is a way for these two men to have some sort of structure in their lives that Vietnam and the war does not, because in this war, there's a lot of uncertainties that these men have to deal with. Like in that last little blurb, it talks about having rules, being able to see your enemy, and that's something you just can't do, or isn't possible in Vietnam. So, playing a game of checkers is a good way to add a little structure to their lives, and I think that's a good example of how they kind of cope. So another thing that these men would do to help cope was to make jokes and little inside jokes between themselves and use lingo and like macho talk as a way to help with the stresses of war. And I'm gonna read a quote um on page 19. They found jokes to tell. They used a hard vocabulary to contain the terrible softness. Greased, they say. Oft, lit up, zapped while zipping. It wasn't cruelty, just stage presence. They were actors. When someone died, it wasn't quite dying because, in a curious way, it seemed scripted, and because they had their lines mostly memorized. Irony mixed with tragedy, and because they called it by other names, as if to insist and destroy the reality of death itself. They kicked corpses. They cut off thumbs. They talked grunt lingo. They told stories about Ted Lavender's supply of tranquilizers, how the poor guy didn't feel a thing, how incredibly tranquil he was. So these soldiers would make jokes as a way to kind of distance themselves from the tragedies of war. It's a coping mechanism that a lot of people do, even I do a lot of the times. And it's another good reason why historians should read books like these. There's a little insight on the personal relationships and how these soldiers talk to each other.